The sound of the office door opening made everyone in the room turn at once. Claire froze with the pen still inches above the paper while Sophie tightened her arms around her mother's waist. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark charcoal coat damp from the rain outside. He looked calm, composed, and completely out of place in the sterile government office. The receptionist hurried behind him, clearly nervous. "Sir, this is a private meeting," she said carefully. "You cannot just walk in here." But the man barely acknowledged her. His eyes moved across the room until they landed on Sophie's tear-streaked face. Something in his expression shifted instantly. "I think I arrived at exactly the right moment," he said quietly. Victoria Whitmore stood up immediately, surprised for the first time since Claire had entered the building. "Ethan?" she asked sharply. "What are you doing here?" Claire looked back and forth between them, confused. Ethan Blackwood. Even Claire recognized the name. Everyone in New York did. Billionaire investor. Owner of Blackwood Holdings. One of the youngest business leaders in the country. She had seen his face once on a television mounted above the diner counter while serving late-night customers. Men like him existed in a completely different world from hers. Ethan stepped farther into the room, rainwater still glistening slightly on his coat sleeves. "I was told there was a legal matter involving the Whitmore family," he said evenly. "I did not realize it involved threatening a mother into surrendering her child." Victoria's jaw tightened. "This situation does not concern you." "A crying little girl always concerns me," Ethan replied. Sophie stared up at him with wide eyes while clutching her backpack tighter. Claire immediately stepped protectively in front of her daughter despite having no idea who this man truly was. Ethan noticed the movement. Even terrified and exhausted, Claire's first instinct had been to shield her child. That alone told him more than any document sitting on the desk. Victoria crossed her arms. "Claire Bennett is financially unstable and incapable of providing proper care. We are offering the child a better future." Ethan slowly glanced toward the papers on the desk before looking back at Claire. Her mascara had slightly smeared beneath her eyes from trying not to cry. The sleeves of her pale blue sweater were worn thin near the wrists. Her hands trembled from stress and exhaustion. Yet Sophie never let go of her mother for even a second. Ethan had spent years around people who lied for advantage. He knew what manipulation looked like. And this did not look like neglect. It looked like desperation. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said gently, "did anyone explain your legal rights before placing these documents in front of you?" Claire hesitated. "They said if I do not sign voluntarily, the court process could become worse for Sophie." Victoria immediately interrupted. "Because it is the truth." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "No. It is pressure." The room fell silent. Claire felt her heartbeat pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Nobody had defended her in a very long time. Not landlords. Not employers. Not social workers too busy to care. Certainly not powerful people. Yet this stranger had walked in and questioned everything within seconds. Victoria tried to regain control. "Ethan, you do not understand the full circumstances." "Then explain them," he said calmly. Victoria gestured toward Claire dismissively. "The mother is drowning financially. She lives in a deteriorating apartment in Queens. She works inconsistent shifts at a diner. The child deserves opportunities, education, stability." Claire lowered her eyes again in humiliation. Every weakness in her life sounded even uglier spoken aloud in this cold office. But before shame could completely consume her, Sophie suddenly spoke in a trembling voice. "My mommy reads to me every night," the little girl whispered. Everyone turned toward her. Sophie wiped her cheeks with her sleeve. "She makes pancakes shaped like stars on Saturdays even when she is tired. And she sleeps on the couch when I have nightmares because she says monsters do not come near moms." Claire covered her mouth as tears instantly filled her eyes again. Ethan remained completely still, listening carefully while Sophie continued softly. "We are not bad people," she said. "We are just broke sometimes. The innocence of those words seemed to hit the entire room at once. Even the receptionist standing near the door looked uncomfortable now. Claire knelt down quickly and hugged Sophie tightly again. "Baby, you do not have to explain us to anyone," she whispered emotionally. But Ethan could already see the truth more clearly than ever. This was not a child trapped in danger. This was a child terrified of losing the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally. Ethan looked down at the relinquishment papers one more time before reaching toward them slowly. Claire watched in disbelief as Ethan slowly tore the relinquishment papers straight down the middle. The sharp sound of ripping paper echoed through the office like a thunderclap. Sophie gasped softly beside her mother while the receptionist near the door covered her mouth in shock. Victoria Whitmore's face drained of color. "What have you done?" she snapped, stepping forward. Ethan calmly dropped the torn pages onto the desk. "I stopped a frightened mother from being manipulated into signing away her child." Claire felt frozen in place. For several seconds she could not even breathe properly. The crushing pressure that had trapped her chest all morning suddenly loosened just enough for air to return to her lungs. Sophie wrapped both arms tightly around Claire's waist and buried her face against her sweater. "Mommy," the little girl whispered shakily, "does this mean I can stay with you?" Claire immediately held her daughter close, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, baby," she whispered emotionally. "Yes." Victoria slammed her hand against the desk in frustration. "This changes nothing," she said sharply. "I can have new documents prepared within the hour." Ethan remained completely calm. "And I can have attorneys here within 15 minutes. The room fell silent again. Claire looked at Ethan with stunned confusion. Why would someone like him care this much about strangers? Ethan turned toward the social services caseworker who had remained silent during most of the confrontation. "Did anyone inform Miss Bennett that voluntary surrender without independent legal counsel is strongly discouraged under New York family law?" The woman looked visibly uncomfortable. "We usually recommend counsel, yes." "Usually?" Ethan asked. The woman lowered her eyes immediately. Victoria stepped in before the conversation could continue. "This family matter does not require outside interference. A child being pressured away from her mother absolutely requires interference," Ethan replied. Claire noticed something different in his voice now. It was still calm, but underneath it was unmistakable anger. Not loud anger. Controlled anger. The kind that carried power without needing to shout. Sophie slowly peeked up at Ethan from behind her mother. "Are you a lawyer?" she asked innocently. For the first time since entering the room, Ethan smiled slightly. "No," he answered gently. "But I know people who are very good at stopping unfair things." Sophie nodded seriously as if that explanation made perfect sense. Claire could not stop staring at him. Everything about this situation felt unreal. Hours earlier she had been terrified she was about to lose her child forever. Now one of the wealthiest men in America was defending her like he had known her for years. Victoria grabbed her designer handbag sharply. "You are making a mistake, Ethan," she warned. "The Whitmore family will not forget this." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "Neither will Sophie." Victoria's expression hardened. "You think you understand what is best for that child after walking into one meeting." Ethan glanced toward Claire and Sophie standing together near the corner of the room. Sophie still refused to let go of her mother's hand even for a second. "I understand enough," he said quietly. "Children do not cling to people they fear losing unless those people are their safe place." Claire felt her throat tighten painfully hearing those words. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Not a safe place. Not important. Most days she felt invisible to the world. Just another exhausted woman struggling to survive New York rent prices and overdue bills. Yet somehow Ethan had seen something valuable in her within minutes. Victoria finally stormed toward the door. Before leaving, she looked directly at Claire one last time. "This is not over," she said coldly. Then she walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hallway floors until the sound disappeared completely. The office suddenly became quiet except for the rain tapping softly against the windows. Claire slowly looked down at the shredded documents scattered across the desk. Pieces of paper that had nearly destroyed her life only minutes ago. Ethan loosened his tie slightly, exhaling for the first time since arriving. The caseworker awkwardly gathered a few folders together before quietly excusing herself from the room as well. Soon only Claire, Sophie, and Ethan remained. Claire wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by how emotional she looked. "I do not understand why you helped us," she admitted honestly. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because nobody should have to prove they deserve to love their own child." Claire lowered her gaze again, overwhelmed. Sophie suddenly tugged lightly on Ethan's coat sleeve. "Mister," she said softly, "thank you for saving my mommy." Ethan looked down at the little girl, and something in his expression softened instantly. "Your mommy was already fighting for you," he replied gently. "I just made sure someone finally listened." Claire felt tears threaten to return all over again. But before she could say anything else, Ethan's phone vibrated inside his coat pocket. He glanced briefly at the screen, and his expression changed immediately. Serious. Focused. Like he had just realized something important. Slowly, he looked back toward Claire. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "I think there is a lot more happening here than you have been told." Claire stared at Ethan uncertainly as the last of the tension slowly settled over the quiet office. Outside the tall windows, the rain continued pouring across Manhattan streets, while distant sirens echoed faintly through the city. Sophie sat beside her mother now, still holding tightly onto Claire's hand as if afraid someone might suddenly come back and take her away. Ethan slipped his phone back into his coat pocket and looked toward the door Victoria had just exited through. "Someone inside the Whitmore legal team leaked information this morning," he said carefully. "That is why I came here." Claire frowned in confusion. "What kind of information?" Ethan hesitated briefly before answering. "The inheritance revision involving Sophie is worth far more than you realize." Claire immediately shook her head. "I do not want their money." "That may not matter to them," Ethan replied quietly. Sophie looked between the adults, trying hard to understand. "What is inheritance?" she asked softly. Claire gently brushed her daughter's hair behind her ear. "It is grown-up stuff, sweetheart." Ethan crouched slightly so he could speak closer to Sophie's eye level. "It means some people think money is more important than love," he explained gently. Sophie frowned seriously at that answer. "That sounds mean." Ethan gave a small nod. "Sometimes it is." Claire watched the interaction carefully. Most wealthy men she had encountered in life barely acknowledged children unless cameras were nearby. But Ethan spoke to Sophie patiently, naturally, like her feelings actually mattered. It unsettled her more than she expected. Because for the first time in years, she wanted to trust someone. And trusting people had only ever hurt her before. "Why are you involved with the Whitmores at all?" Claire finally asked. Ethan stood back up slowly. "Blackwood Holdings recently partnered with several Whitmore business divisions." Claire immediately looked uncomfortable again. "So you are connected to them?" Ethan noticed the fear returning to her expression. "Business connection does not mean loyalty," he said calmly. Claire lowered her eyes. "You still belong to their world." The honesty in her voice surprised him. Ethan glanced around the office. The fluorescent lights. The faded government walls. The plastic chairs. Then he looked back at Claire standing protectively beside her daughter in a worn sweater and discount store sneakers. "No," he answered quietly. "I just learned long ago how dangerous that world can become when nobody challenges it." Claire did not know what to say to that. Before the silence could stretch further, Ethan's phone rang again. He answered immediately, turning slightly away while listening carefully. Claire could only hear pieces of the conversation. "How many reports?" Ethan asked sharply. A pause. "And they all came from the same source?" Another pause followed before Ethan's expression hardened again. "Send everything to my office. Now." He ended the call and looked back toward Claire with visible concern. Miss Bennet, have you noticed anything unusual recently? People watching your apartment? Questions from strangers? Unexpected visits? Claire blinked nervously. A woman came to the diner 2 weeks ago asking about Sophie. What did she want? Ethan asked. She claimed she represented a private school scholarship foundation. Claire explained slowly. At first I thought she was being kind, but she kept asking personal questions. How often I worked. Whether Sophie stayed home alone. Whether we had relatives nearby. Ethan exchanged a grim look with the receptionist still quietly organizing paperwork near the doorway. It was never about a scholarship, he said. Claire felt her stomach twist uneasily. You think they were investigating me? I think they were building a case against you, Ethan replied. Sophie moved closer against her mother instantly. Claire wrapped one arm protectively around her daughter while fear returned stronger than before. Can they still take her? She whispered. Ethan answered without hesitation. Not if I can help it. The certainty in his voice startled her again. He sounded completely serious. Completely committed. As though he had already decided this fight mattered personally to him. Claire looked away quickly because the emotion building inside her chest felt overwhelming. Nobody had stood beside her this firmly since Sophie was born. Not once. Ethan checked his watch briefly before speaking again. You should not go home alone tonight. Claire immediately stiffened. I can take care of myself. I am sure you can, Ethan replied calmly. But Victoria Whitmore is not used to hearing the word no. Claire hated the fact that he was probably right. Her tiny apartment suddenly felt far less safe than it had this morning. Sophie rubbed her tired eyes softly. Mommy, I am sleepy. Claire looked down at her daughter and instantly remembered they had not even eaten lunch yet. The entire day had become a nightmare so quickly that basic things no longer seemed real. Ethan noticed the exhaustion on both their faces. There is a private driver downstairs, he said carefully. He can take you somewhere safe for the night. Claire's protective instincts rose immediately again. Why would you do that for us? Ethan held her gaze steadily for several long seconds before answering. Because the moment I walked into this room, I realized everyone here was treating you like a problem instead of a mother. Claire felt tears sting her eyes again. But this time they came with something far more dangerous than sadness. Relief. And deep down, that terrified her almost as much as losing everything had. Nearly 40 minutes later, Claire sat stiffly in the back seat of a black luxury SUV as it moved through the rainy streets of Manhattan. Sophie had fallen asleep beside her, curled against her side with one small hand still clutching the sleeve of Claire's sweater. The little girl looked exhausted after the emotional storm of the day, but for the first time since morning, she was finally sleeping peacefully. Claire gently brushed Sophie's hair back while staring out the rain-covered window. Everything still felt unreal. Across from her sat Ethan Blackwood, reviewing documents on a tablet, while occasionally answering quiet phone calls. Even in silence, he carried the kind of calm authority that made people listen carefully whenever he spoke. Claire shifted uncomfortably. She had never been inside a vehicle like this before. The soft leather seats, the warm interior lighting, even the quiet hum of the engine reminded her how far his world was from hers. You do not have to keep looking so nervous, Ethan said without looking up from the screen. Claire blinked slightly. I am sitting in a billionaire's car after almost losing my daughter this morning. Nervous feels reasonable. To her surprise, Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Not mocking. Genuine. Fair point, he admitted. Claire looked down quickly, embarrassed by how human that brief moment suddenly made him feel. The SUV eventually stopped in front of a tall brownstone building on the Upper East Side. Warm golden lights glowed through the large windows despite the storm outside. Claire immediately frowned. This is a hotel? No, Ethan replied. It belongs to my family office. There are private guest suites upstairs. Claire's protective instincts immediately returned. I cannot stay here. Ethan closed the tablet slowly. Miss Bennet, someone has already been gathering information about your routines and apartment. Until I understand how far the Whitmores are willing to go, I would prefer you somewhere secure. Claire looked towards sleeping Sophie beside her. The truth was painfully obvious. Going back to their apartment tonight suddenly felt unsafe. Still, accepting help this big made her deeply uncomfortable. Nothing in life is free, she said quietly. Ethan studied her expression for a moment before answering. Who taught you that? Claire gave a small bitter smile. Life. Ethan nodded once as though he understood more than she expected. A few minutes later, Claire carefully carried Sophie upstairs while Ethan walked slightly ahead through the elegant hallway. The suite he opened looked larger than Claire's entire apartment. Soft cream-colored furniture filled the living room beside tall windows overlooking the city skyline. Fresh flowers sat near the kitchen counter, and warm lamps lit the room gently enough to make it feel peaceful instead of expensive. Claire hesitated near the doorway. People actually live like this? She asked softly before realizing she had spoken out loud. Ethan glanced back at her. Some do. Claire carefully laid Sophie down on one of the bedroom beds. The little girl barely stirred, exhausted beyond words. After pulling the blanket gently over her daughter, Claire stood there silently for a long moment just watching Sophie sleep. Safe. Still with her. She quietly closed the bedroom door before walking back into the living room where Ethan stood near the windows, staring down at the rain-soaked city below. Thank you, Claire said sincerely. Ethan turned toward her. You do not owe me gratitude yet. We still have problems to solve. Claire wrapped her arms around herself nervously. Why are you really helping me? She asked again. People like you do not usually stop their lives for strangers. Ethan remained quiet for several seconds before finally answering. When I was 12 years old, my mother lost custody battles against people with more money and influence than she had. Claire looked at him in surprise. Ethan's voice stayed calm, but something painful lingered underneath it now. The courts called it stability. He continued. But what they really meant was wealth. Claire slowly sat down on the edge of the couch, listening carefully. What happened? Ethan looked away briefly toward the rain outside. My mother spent years trying to prove she loved me enough to deserve me. Claire felt her chest tighten painfully hearing those words. Suddenly Ethan did not seem untouchable anymore. He sounded like someone who understood exactly what fear she carried inside her. Ethan exhaled slowly before looking back at her. That is why I knew immediately something was wrong in that office today. Claire lowered her eyes. I almost signed the papers. But you did not, Ethan replied firmly. Claire swallowed hard. Only because you walked in. Silence filled the room again, softer this time. Then Ethan's phone vibrated once more on the table beside him. He glanced at the message, and his entire expression sharpened instantly. They found something, he said quietly. Claire felt nervous immediately. What kind of something? Ethan looked directly at her now. Evidence that someone inside the Whitmore family may have intentionally created false reports against you for months. Claire stared at Ethan in disbelief as the rain continued sliding down the tall windows behind him. False reports? She repeated quietly. Ethan gave a slow nod and placed his phone onto the table. My legal team traced several anonymous complaints submitted against you over the past 6 months. They originated from the same private investigation firm connected to the Whitmore family. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. 6 months? Ethan walked toward the kitchen counter where a folder had just been delivered by one of his assistants. He opened it carefully and spread several printed pages across the marble surface. Noise complaints from neighbors that never existed. Claims that Sophie missed school repeatedly despite perfect attendance records. Reports suggesting neglect with no supporting evidence. Claire moved closer slowly, staring at the documents with trembling hands. They were building a file against me the entire time, she whispered. Ethan looked directly at her. Yes. Claire suddenly remembered every strange interaction from the past several months. The landlord asking unusually personal questions. Random phone calls hanging up after she answered. The woman at the diner pretending to discuss scholarship opportunities. She had thought life was simply becoming harder. She never imagined someone had been carefully shaping that hardship into evidence against her. Why would they do this to Sophie? Claire asked painfully. Because controlling you was the easiest path to controlling her, Ethan answered. Claire closed her eyes for a moment as guilt crashed over her again. I should have seen it. No, Ethan said firmly. You were busy surviving. His words hit her harder than she expected. Surviving. That was exactly what life had become for years now. Working endless shifts. Stretching every dollar. Pretending everything was okay for Sophie even when she cried alone at night after unpaid bills piled across the kitchen counter. Claire looked down at the papers again. I kept thinking if I worked harder, things would finally stabilize. Ethan's expression softened slightly. People like Victoria count on mothers blaming themselves first. Before Claire could respond, Sophie suddenly wandered sleepily out of the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. Mommy? She whispered. Claire immediately crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter. What is wrong, baby? Sophie looked around the unfamiliar suite nervously. I had a bad dream that you disappeared. Claire hugged her tightly without hesitation. I am right here. Sophie held on to her mother for several long seconds before finally relaxing. Ethan watched silently. From across the room. The connection between them was impossible to miss. Not perfect. Not wealthy. But deeply real. Sophie eventually noticed the papers spread across the counter. Are those bad papers again? She asked cautiously. Ethan looked toward her. No, he said gently. Those are papers helping your mommy now. Sophie studied him carefully for a moment. You really do stop unfair things. Ethan smiled faintly. I try. Sophie nodded seriously before climbing onto the couch beside Claire. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled her back to sleep against her mother's shoulder. Claire gently tucked a blanket around her daughter while Ethan returned to the documents. There is more, he said quietly. Claire looked up nervously. Ethan handed her one specific page. This investigator was paid through a private trust connected to Victoria Whitmore personally. Claire scanned the numbers and legal names without fully understanding them, but one thing became painfully clear. None of this had been accidental. Victoria had planned everything. Can she be charged for this? Claire asked softly. Ethan leaned against the counter thoughtfully. Possibly. But people with money usually protect themselves carefully. Claire laughed bitterly under her breath. Of course they do. Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking again. I know this feels overwhelming, but the evidence changes everything legally. Once my attorneys present this, the pressure campaign against you becomes very difficult to defend. Claire looked towards sleeping Sophie again. I just want my daughter safe. I know, Ethan said quietly. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Claire quickly looked away again because something inside her chest suddenly felt dangerous. Not fear this time. Something warmer. Softer. She had spent so many years carrying every burden alone that simple kindness now felt almost unbearable. Ethan's phone buzzed once more. He checked the message and frowned slightly. Victoria requested an emergency family hearing tomorrow morning. Claire's face instantly paled. Tomorrow? Ethan nodded. She is moving quickly because she knows the evidence against her will spread soon. Claire's breathing became uneven again. What if the judge still sides with them? Ethan walked closer calmly. Then we fight harder. Claire shook her head helplessly. You say that like winning is easy. Ethan's voice softened slightly. No. I say it because you deserve someone willing to fight beside you. Claire felt tears fill her eyes again before she quickly turned away, embarrassed. Nobody had said words like that to her in years. Ethan noticed her reaction but did not push further. Instead, he picked up the folder and closed it carefully. Get some rest tonight, he said gently. Tomorrow, they are going to learn something important. Claire looked back at him quietly. What? Ethan's eyes settled briefly on sleeping Sophie before returning to Claire. That loving your child is not weakness. And neither are you. The next morning, Claire sat inside the crowded family courtroom with Sophie beside her, and Ethan seated only a few feet away. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, but the warmth outside did nothing to calm the storm twisting inside Claire's chest. Sophie held tightly onto her mother's hand while quietly swinging her small legs beneath the wooden bench. Across the room, Victoria Whitmore sat beside two expensive attorneys wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and an expression of cold confidence. It was obvious she expected to win. Claire glanced nervously at Ethan. He looked calm as always, reviewing several folders while speaking quietly with his legal team. The difference between them felt impossible to ignore. Victoria had wealth and influence. Ethan had power and preparation. Claire only had fear and love for her daughter. But somehow Ethan acted as though that was enough. The courtroom doors opened, and the judge entered. Everyone stood before taking their seats again. Claire's heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear the opening statements. Victoria's attorney rose first, speaking smoothly about financial instability, uncertain housing conditions, and the opportunities available through the Whitmore family. Every sentence made Claire feel smaller. Poorer. Less worthy. Then Ethan's attorney stood. Unlike the polished performance from the other side, his voice carried sharp precision. He immediately presented the evidence Ethan's team uncovered overnight. False complaints. Private investigators. Coordinated reports submitted through shell companies connected to Victoria Whitmore. The courtroom atmosphere changed instantly. The judge's expression hardened as document after document was placed before him. Victoria shifted uncomfortably for the first time since arriving. Are you denying these connections? The judge asked firmly. One of Victoria's attorneys quickly stood. Your Honor, these allegations are being exaggerated. Ethan's attorney calmly slid another file across the table. Then perhaps the payment records and recorded investigator communications can explain themselves. Claire stared in shock as the evidence continued piling up. She had spent months believing she was failing as a mother, never realizing someone had carefully engineered that feeling around her. The judge looked directly toward Victoria. Did your family authorize surveillance of Miss Bennett without proper legal disclosure? Victoria straightened her posture. We were protecting family interests. Claire felt anger rise sharply inside her chest hearing those words. Family interests. As though Sophie were a business asset instead of a child. The judge's expression darkened further. Children are not financial arrangements, Mrs. Whitmore. Sophie looked up at Claire quietly. Mommy, are we in trouble? Claire immediately squeezed her daughter's hand gently. No, sweetheart. Ethan leaned slightly towards Sophie from beside them. You are doing very brave today, he said softly. Sophie gave a tiny nervous nod. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria herself stood up. Your Honor, she said carefully, regardless of procedural mistakes, Miss Bennett still cannot provide the future this child deserves. Claire lowered her eyes instantly. Those words still hurt no matter how cruel Victoria had proven herself to be. Victoria continued confidently. The Whitmore family can offer private education, security, travel opportunities, financial stability. Things the mother simply cannot provide. The courtroom grew quiet. Claire felt humiliated all over again because part of her feared Victoria was right. She could not afford private schools. She could barely afford groceries some weeks. Ethan slowly stood beside Claire then, his voice calm but unwavering. Your Honor, may I say something before this hearing concludes? The judge nodded. Ethan looked toward Victoria first. You keep speaking about what money can buy, he said evenly. But you still fail to understand what this child actually values. Then he turned gently towards Sophie. Sophie, he asked softly, would you like to tell the judge where you want to live? Claire's heart nearly stopped. Sophie looked frightened at first as every adult in the courtroom suddenly focused on her. Claire brushed her daughter's hair gently. You only tell the truth, baby. Sophie slowly slid off the bench and stood carefully beside her mother. Her tiny voice trembled at first. I love my mommy. The courtroom became completely silent. Sophie swallowed hard before continuing. She works really hard. Sometimes she gets tired, but she still makes me breakfast and checks under my bed for monsters every night. Claire covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes instantly. Sophie looked toward the judge bravely now. I do not need a giant house, she whispered. I just need my mom. Even the courtroom staff looked emotional hearing those words. Victoria's attorneys quietly lowered their eyes. Ethan stood silently beside Claire, giving her the strength to stay standing while tears streamed down her cheeks. The judge removed his glasses slowly and looked across the room one final time before speaking. This court sees no evidence that Sophie Bennett is unsafe with her mother. Claire stopped breathing. Furthermore, the judge continued firmly, the actions taken against Miss Bennett raise serious ethical concerns that will be reviewed separately. Claire felt Sophie throw her arms tightly around her waist. Mommy! The little girl cried happily. We get to stay together. Claire collapsed into tears while hugging her daughter tightly. And standing only inches away, Ethan quietly watched them both with an expression Claire would never forget. 3 months later, the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted through the small bakery on the corner of Lexington Avenue and East 83rd Street. Morning sunlight poured through the front windows while customers chatted quietly over coffee and pastries. A painted wooden sign near the register read Bennett Bakery in soft, gold lettering, and beneath it sat a framed drawing Sophie had proudly made with bright crayons. Claire stood behind the counter wearing a pale cream apron dusted lightly with flour while carefully arranging blueberry muffins onto a display tray. For the first time in years, her shoulders no longer carried the constant weight of fear. Life still was not perfect. The apartment was still modest. Bills still existed. But the crushing feeling of barely surviving every single day had finally begun to fade. Sophie ran excitedly from one table to another carrying napkins much too carefully for a 7-year-old trying hard to feel grown-up. Mommy! She whispered loudly. Table 4 said your chocolate chip cookies are the best in New York. Claire laughed softly. Did they really? Sophie nodded proudly. I think we are becoming famous. Claire smiled at her daughter, and for once the smile reached her eyes completely. The bakery had started as a simple idea Ethan encouraged during the weeks following the court hearing. He discovered Claire loved baking after noticing she always made homemade treats for Sophie despite having almost no money. At first Claire refused his help completely. Pride and fear still lived deep inside her after years of disappointment. But Ethan never treated her like a charity project. Instead, he helped her secure a small business loan through legitimate channels, introduced her to a trustworthy accountant, and quietly made sure the location became available before another buyer could take it. He never demanded credit. Never pushed too hard. He simply stood nearby whenever life became overwhelming. The bell above the bakery door rang softly then. Sophie immediately looked up and grinned. He is here. Claire turned toward the entrance just as Ethan Blackwood stepped inside wearing a dark coat against the cold autumn air. Outside, several customers glanced up in quiet recognition, but Ethan ignored the attention completely. His focus settled immediately on Claire and Sophie. Sophie ran straight toward him. You are late, she announced dramatically. Ethan knelt slightly as she hugged him. I was trapped in a very boring meeting. Sophie gasped playfully. That sounds terrible. It was, Ethan agreed seriously. Claire shook her head while smiling despite herself. Watching them together still felt strangely unreal sometimes. Ethan carried the same calm confidence he always had, but around Sophie he became softer somehow. Lighter. More human. Ethan walked toward the counter while Sophie proudly dragged him behind her to inspect the newest pastries. We made caramel apple muffins today, she informed him. Mommy burned the first batch a little, but these are good. Claire laughed in embarrassment. Thank you for exposing my kitchen disasters. Ethan smiled faintly. I will still risk trying one. Their eyes met briefly across the counter, and Claire felt that familiar warmth rise softly in her chest again. Over the past few months, Ethan had become something steady in their lives. Not through grand speeches or dramatic promises. Through consistency. Phone calls asking if Sophie was feeling better after a cold. Quiet visits after long workdays. Remembering small things nobody else noticed. Claire once believed powerful men only brought pain into her life. Ethan slowly taught her that some people protected instead of destroyed. Sophie climbed onto one of the stools nearby while swinging her legs happily. "Mommy smiles more now," she announced suddenly. Claire nearly dropped the coffee cup in her hand. "Sophie," she whispered, embarrassed. But Ethan looked at Claire thoughtfully before answering. "I noticed that too." Claire felt her cheeks warm slightly and quickly focused on wiping the counter even though it was already clean. Outside the bakery windows, New York moved through another busy morning. Taxis honked. Pedestrians hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Yet for Claire, everything had changed. Months ago she stood in a cold office believing the world had decided she was not enough for her child. Now Sophie laughed freely only a few feet away while sunlight filled a bakery built from hope Claire once thought she had lost forever. Ethan picked up one of the caramel apple muffins and took a careful bite. Sophie watched him expectantly. "Well?" she demanded. Ethan nodded seriously. "Definitely worth surviving boring meetings for." Sophie cheered proudly while Claire laughed again, the sound warm and genuine this time. Ethan looked at her quietly for a moment afterward, and there was something unspoken in his expression. Not pressure. Not pity. Just the quiet certainty that sometimes the right people enter your life exactly when you are about to give up. And as Claire stood there watching Sophie smile beside the man who had changed everything with one impossible act of kindness, she realized something she never thought she would feel again. The future no longer scared her.